Shall we get going?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. All right, folks, we're going to get going. I expect we may have a couple more people coming in. First, I want to welcome everybody and taking time out. We are also live streaming this on Zoom and Facebook for people that maybe are not here. That will be something that we have learned in the past. Those numbers add considerably to the participants. So welcome to the 21st century. This is how it works. I first want to thank our distinguished colleagues, Dr. Mirdad Kia and Artie Kia. And Artie, a big thank you very much for always all your efforts and your work. And Dr. Kia, you too as well. And make mention that our next program, which is October 5th, is going to be discussing Iran, Russia, and the U.S. So we will make sure to get that out there in ample time so people know about this. But that will be a panel discussion featuring Dr. Kia. Just very briefly, you would and should have been expecting Dexter Tiff Roberts to be in the seat of my colleague, Michael Mayer. Tiff is not feeling very well, sends his regards and his apologies as he was not able to make it today. So Michael and myself will do our level best to fill in for somebody whose shoes, based on his background as former bureau chief for Bloomberg Business Week in China, a Chinese language speaker, now living here in Missoula. So you're not going to find anybody more knowledgeable or more connected, and we promise to get Tiff back at an appropriate time. So I want to introduce my colleague, Michael Mayer, retired history professor, University of Montana, and he'll give you a little bit of background on what he is now currently doing. The green.
Pardon?
Speak, please.
Is it on? No.
Tech people should be green. We're not getting that. Our first challenge. All right, well, we're waiting for that to happen. Just a little background. I want to also thank Chris Heaslip and the Montana World Affairs Council for their participation. They have been a great supporter of the Central Southwest Asian program for many, many years, and I'm sure you're familiar with the World Affairs Council programs. Chris is in Bozeman with some guests that were here last night, so he was not able to make it, but he sends his regards as well. So I was president for the council for a period probably of 12, 13 years, and probably should have been rotating off the board earlier, but it was a passion and interest of mine for many years. I'm now president emeritus. As a professional person, my work on a daily basis is as an investment advisor, one of the founding partners of SG Long Financial here in Missoula, which I think back, that's over 35 years of doing that. And due to the graciousness and kindness of Dr. Key and Artie, I'm also a visiting scholar at the Southwest Central Asian program as well. So just a little background on myself, but let's get busy here because we got a lot to discuss. And Michael, are you now connected?
I think so.
All right.
Can you hear me?
So I just asked you to give a little brief background on currently what you are now doing.
I'm now being retired.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm here. It's actually there are a couple of things. Mirdad and I have a show that comes, a radio show that comes on the first Tuesday of every month on basically on current affairs, and also on the third Monday. I can't keep this straight. I rely on Mirdad for that. The discussion of books. And last this just 2 days ago, we had our opening show of books, and we talked about Jean Twenge's iGen. And next month, we'll be talking about Ari Fleischer's book on media bias. And so I hope people will tune in and participate. And beyond that, I want to join Bob in thanking Mirdad and Artie for this and so many other programs that they bring to the campus. And sorry that the speaker you're expecting isn't here. And I'll do the best I can to fill in and offer something. This was put together pretty quickly. If it has the appearance of being sort of offhand, it's because it's sort of offhand. It really is hard to present a coherent overview of the situation in Ukraine, in Russia, China, because it changes by the day, even by the hour, and sometimes by the latest presidential gaffe. But what I want to do in part is to provide some sort of historical context. Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine did not come out of the blue. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he clearly has ambition to restore some semblance of either the USSR or Imperial Russia. Remember, he invaded Georgia, he invaded Ukraine and took the Crimea in 2014. And I think one key perspective to keep in mind is that Putin senses weakness and strikes. In 2008, George W. Bush had low poll rankings. He had lost Congress. There was an upcoming election. Putin used the opportunity to invade Georgia. As a candidate in 2008, Barack Obama criticized George W. Bush for being too confrontational toward Russia and called for what he described as a reset. Obama got off on a bad foot in that regard. In March of 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, with a gift. It was a little red button like those old Staples commercials that had reset, and it said reset in English and Peregrushka in Russian. Lavrov pointed out that Peregrushka meant overcharged, not reset. Not the best start to a reconsideration. Putin always considered Obama weak. In July of 2009, Obama made a trip to Russia. He spoke to the graduates of Moscow's new economic school, and he urged Moscow to stop viewing the US as an adversary. He said that the assumption that the United States and Russia were antagonists was, quote, a 20th century view rooted in the past. He said in 2009, a great power does not show strength by dominating or demonizing other countries. The days when empires could treat sovereign states as pieces on a chessboard are over. He did, in that same talk, reject the claim that Russia had, quote, privileged interest in the former republics, and he reaffirmed American support for the sovereignty of Georgia and Ukraine. Yet in September 2009, the Obama administration halted deployment of US missile defense in Eastern Europe, hoping for better relations with Russia and hoping for a positive response. Putin did respond by refusing to cooperate with sanctions against Iran. But Obama was absolutely convinced of his ability to charm people. Unfortunately, Putin was utterly oblivious to Obama's charm. And in March 2012, Obama met in Seoul, South Korea with then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. And they discussed an issue of contention, which is that Russia objected to American plans for a missile defense system based in Europe. Obama leaned in and whispered to Medvedev on all these issues, but particularly missile defense. This can be solved, but it's important for him to give me space. Medvedev said, yeah, I understand. Obama said, this is my last election. After my election, I'll have more flexibility. And Medvedev said, I understand. I will transmit this information to Vladimir. All of this was caught on an open mic and recorded by ABC News. During the campaign of 1912, during a debate with Romney, Obama mocked Romney for saying that Russia was, quote, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe. Obama quipped, the 80s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back. And Obama condescendingly explained, quote, the Cold War's been over for 20 years. Well, Obama easily won re-election over the hapless Romney, but Putin then took almost every opportunity he could find to humiliate Obama. In 2013, Putin gave sanctuary to Edward Snowden of WikiLeaks fame. When Obama issued his famous red line in Syria, which turned out to be not so red and not even much of a line, Putin clearly did not take it seriously. In September 2013, a CBS reporter asked Kerry, the Secretary of State, if there was anything Assad could do to prevent an attack from the United States. Kerry said, quote, he could turn over every single bit of chemical weapons to the international community next week. Putin jumped in and offered to get Syria to turn over its chemical weapons if the United States would reject the use of force. Assad subsequently dragged his feet and then used chemical weapons, including chlorine, that was not on the list. In June of 2014, Assad turned over chemicals that were on the list to the Russians. In February, actually on February 25th, 2014, 5 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, appeared on Meet the Press and shrugged off suggestions that Russia was preparing for a military intervention. She said it wasn't necessary to, as she put it, return to a Cold War construct. Such thinking is long out of date and doesn't reflect the realities of the 21st century. We all know what happened after that. It was a remarkable instance of pretending that the world is, in fact, what the administration thought it should be, rather than seeing it for what it was, the world for what it was. In March of 2014, after the Ukrainian Revolution and the ouster of the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, little green men, as they were called, soldiers, troops in green Russian uniforms but without insignia, appeared on the Crimean Peninsula. When Russia invaded, the Obama administration's officials said it was not an invasion. It was an uncontested arrival, and that this distinction was a key to understanding developments. Well, the fact is that euphemism doesn't alter reality. It was an invasion. And soon after the invasion, Obama declared that Russia was on the wrong side of history. An interesting comment, because it indicated a belief that history moved in one direction and that the president knew it. He was fond of saying that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. And one is tempted to paraphrase Stalin and ask how many divisions justice has. The Obama administration sent blankets and MREs to Ukraine, but refused to send what was called lethal aid, in other words, weapons. Adam Rotfeld, Poland's former minister of Foreign Affairs, said the Russians interpreted the reset as a kind of American weakness. And that weakness suggested that Russia had an opportunity to act. And you would see parallels to that, I think, years later in the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. When Russia annexed the Crimea in March of 2014, Obama said the United States does not view Europe as a battleground between East and West, nor do we see the situation in Ukraine as a zero-sum game. That's the kind of thing that should have ended with the Cold War. Well, maybe, but by 2015, Obama's own choice for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff declared that, quote, Russia represents the greatest threat to our national security. Ray Odierno, the outgoing Army Chief of Staff, called Russia, quote, America's most dangerous military threat. And the Secretary of Defense said Russia poses an existential threat to the United States. Apparently 2015 was calling and wanted the 1980s foreign policy back. Well, Russia occupied and annexed Crimea, left forces in the Donbass region. And all of this brings us, I think, to the Ukraine and the Biden administration's response. First of all, it's important to note, I think, that the Biden administration's policy of deterrence failed. Biden later said that the sanctions imposed on Russia were not for deterrence, even though there is video of almost every single top figure in his administration saying that the sanctions were intended to do precisely that. Do these guys forget that we have video these days? You know, that pretty much stuff is recorded. You can call it up pretty easily on the internet. But clearly, I think the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan was an important point. It signaled weakness, and not just to Putin, but to Xi Jinping in China and to the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran. And it's hard to know, again, what would have worked better. Perhaps arming Ukraine to the teeth in advance of the Russian incursion might have deterred Putin, but the Biden administration was worried that such actions would be used as a predicate or a pretext for an invasion. And they also worried that they couldn't mobilize Europe to support opposition to a Russian invasion. And I think there's some evidence that, at least on the second point, that calculation was correct. Putin, in invading Ukraine, hoped to split NATO. And he came much closer to succeeding than people like to think. Look at Germany's initial response. They were very cautious about aiding Ukraine, very reluctant. Only mass demonstrations by Germany's own people convinced the German government to do a 180. Other European nations, even those less dependent on Russian energy than Germany, were cautious or reluctant. Russia's failure to execute its plan to subdue the Ukraine quickly, and then the horrific images in the media allowed a gathering of international opposition to Russian aggression. But if Putin and his military had calculated correctly, I think we'd have seen a very different response from NATO. But I think Putin also miscalculated by launching his invasion in the spring, when Germany and other European nations were less desperate for Russian energy than they would have been with winter coming. We also need to consider Russian nuclear doctrine, which calls for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The object is to raise the stakes so high that the other side would fold. In February of 2021, Putin warned that any interference, quote, from the outside would be met with consequences, quote, such as you have never seen in your entire history. It was widely interpreted as a threat of a nuclear strike. It also may have been a reference to cyber warfare. To back up that threat, though, Putin ordered high-profile nuclear exercises and put his nuclear forces on, quote, special alert status, which is a term that was unfamiliar to US intelligence. And think back just a few minutes earlier today, Putin hinted darkly at the use of nuclear weapons. Whether or not the threat of nuclear weapons or the nuclear strike is a bluff, it did have the effect of limiting the scope of NATO's response. 1 week into the Russian invasion, the United States canceled a long-scheduled test of the Minuteman III ICBM in order to attempt to avoid provocation. Faced with unexpected resistance from the Ukrainian military and resolve from the Ukrainian government, and particularly its leader, Russia's offensive faltered and seemed to settle into a grueling war of attrition. But that war has exacted a heavy toll on Ukraine. Estimates are that at least 9,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed, 15,000 civilians have died, and Russian forces, when unable to capture cities, have simply leveled them. Before the most recent Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia had expanded the area of Ukraine it occupied from about 5% to 20%. That's cut back a bit in the last couple of weeks. But at the same time, the Russian military demonstrated shortcomings in planning, tactics, logistics especially, and leadership. The Pentagon estimates that as many as 80,000 Russian troops have been taken off the battlefield as casualties. In other words, either killed or so badly wounded that they have to be removed from combat. Putin clearly, I think, hopes that the coming winter will bring energy shortages and painfully high prices in Europe, and that will weaken European resolve. Perhaps it will result in European nations exerting pressure on Ukraine to agree to some sort of a truce. I think it's also true, certainly Zelensky is afraid that somehow the Russians will manage to neutralize the nuclear plant at Zaporizhia, and that plant accounts for about a third, almost a third, of Ukrainian electricity. And this is a point at which I think we also need to turn home. Biden's energy policy has played into Putin's hand. Despite Biden's repeated claims that the US is producing record amounts of oil per day, or as he sometimes says, it is approaching record levels of production per day, the fact is the United States produced significantly more oil in 2019 than it does today. The most recent production numbers are clear. The United States produced 11.3 million barrels per day in February. In February 2020, the United States produced 12.8 million barrels per day. And Either figure is below the monthly record of 12.97 million barrels per day in November of 2019. Biden has canceled leases in the Gulf of Mexico and in Alaska's Cook Inlet. And of course, there's the Keystone Pipeline. In May of 2022, May of this year, the Premier of Alberta, Canada, testified before the United States Senate. He said that the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline eliminated the ability to move 25% more oil per day than the 670,000 barrels the U.S. imported daily from Russia in 2021. Put it another way, Biden has leased fewer acres of federal land for oil and gas than any president since 1960. Biden, in his first 19 months, has allowed the leasing of 130,000 acres. By comparison, Trump allowed the leasing of 4.4 million acres in his first 19 months. Obama leased 7.25 million acres in his first 19 months. Clinton leased 9.7 million acres in his first 19 months, and Jimmy Carter leased 11.8 million acres in his first 19 months. The United States seems to be, at least to some degree, following the path of green politicians in Europe who seemed perfectly happy to get gas from Putin as long as they didn't have to produce fossil fuels in their own countries. Germany, a leader of green policy in Europe, not only depended heavily on Russian energy, but Germany, the leader in going green and canceling its nuclear, closing down its nuclear plants, got less than 10% of its energy from wind and solar. They didn't make other alternatives, and now they're desperately looking for Russian oil and gas to prevent real shortages in the coming months. When Trump warned European leaders that their policies were making them more and more dependent on Europe, they literally laughed at him in public. They laughed at him. And now, facing a cutoff of Russian gas and oil, the Europeans are facing widespread shortages, crippling high prices, and to coin a phrase, winter is coming. U.S. relations with China, I think, also reflect a historical pattern of misjudgment. At least since the Clinton administration, the United States has been guided by the belief that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. But things haven't worked out that way. Aaron Friedberg, a professor of international relations at Princeton, has published a book called Getting China Wrong. In it, he argues that such beliefs or hopes were misguided. He writes, the history of the last half century of relations between China and the West can be briefly summarized. The United States and other liberal democracies opened their doors to China in the belief that by doing so, they would cause its system to converge more closely with their own. Instead, rather than a liberal and cooperative partner, China has become an increasingly wealthy and powerful competitor, repressive at home and aggressive abroad. I think it's interesting that Friedberg published a book called A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia back in 2010. And that book was widely criticized and considered alarmist and hawkish. Looking back, it seems almost prescient. Friedberg has argued that the policy of Western nations has resulted in part from a triumphalist view of the world after victory in the Cold War. But Friedberg points out that it is not just Xi. He downplays, in fact, the role that Xi has played in setting China's course. He points out that increased repression, heightened nationalism, growing assertiveness all appeared under Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, and so too the reliance on a high-tech industrial policy. China, as has been in the news, has been menacing Taiwan. There are regular Chinese forays into Taiwanese airspace. In January of this year, Xi told his military that it needs to be prepared for war at any second. US military and intelligence analysts estimate that the Chinese are likely to attack Taiwan between 2025 and 2030. And the Chinese are engaging in a huge military and especially naval buildup. In June of this year, China launched its first domestically designed and constructed aircraft carrier. And it is an ultra-modern piece of military equipment. It is a huge upgrade over the Soviet-era Hulk that China purchased from Russia and then reproduced to create its first fleet of aircraft carriers. Australia's defense minister, Richard Marles, said in July of this year, quote, China's military buildup is now the largest and most ambitious we've seen by any country since the end of World War II. And of course, after Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, China engaged in massive military drills. The first round was focused on encircling Taiwan and preventing potential American military relief. The second round focused on anti-submarine warfare. To many of America's allies and to many nations who sit somewhere in between looking for guidance from America, Taiwan serves as a benchmark for the credibility of the United States. The fact is that China is a far more substantial military threat than Russia. It is also a far greater economic power than Russia. And Taiwan, which is a prosperous, vaguely democratic country, is spending just 2%, a little over 2% of its GDP on defense. There's one other area that I want to go to before turning it back over, and that is something that people joke about a lot, but I'm not sure that it's it's a joke anymore, and that is a series of gaffes by our president. Candidate Biden said a president's words matter, and he was right. But the fact is that very much like his predecessor, Biden is a blowhard, a braggart, and a liar. What's more, he's careless. In 1 week, he said, if Russia used chemical weapons, the United States would, quote, respond in kind. His aides rushed to clean that one up. He said US troops would, quote, see for themselves what things were like in Ukraine. The White House worked through several different versions of trying to clean that one up and walk it back. And then Biden declared that Putin, quote, cannot remain in power. His aides, and then subsequently even the president said that he didn't mean regime change, but then Biden doubled down on it and nobody knew exactly what American policy was. That lack of clarity can lead to a miscalculation that can lead to war. What's more, Biden went on to say that he didn't say any of these things. Once again, do these people not realize there's video? I mean, everything is recorded these days. Biden has said on 4 occasions publicly, the United States would defend Taiwan. That's a marked departure from the US policy of strategic ambiguity. What is American policy? At what point will the Chinese have overstepped? We don't know. Chinese don't know, and that is a dangerous situation. It isn't only a question of Biden's age. Biden was always reckless with his public statements. Remember, it was Biden who let slip the highly classified secret that it was the Navy SEAL Team 6 that was responsible for killing bin Laden. I mean, that should have banned him from access to classified materials for the rest of his life. And all of this raises another concern, and that also came up today, and that's the issue of the attempts to revive the Iranian nuclear deal. Under the original deal in 2015, the United States trusted Russia to take possession of Iran's enriched uranium. The Biden administration continues to propose that. Does anybody think that is a good idea? The Biden administration has also proposed circumventing economic sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard by setting off sort of enterprises owned by the IRG and somehow excluding them from the effect of sanctions. Moreover, the proposed deal would postpone Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons only till 2030, which is now just 8 years away. And I conclude with this thought. We are now witnessing just how difficult and complicated Russia's possession of nuclear arms has made it to respond to conventional aggression by Russia. think how difficult it would be to respond to Iranian adventurism if that were covered by a nuclear deterrent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Michael, thank you very much. I am cognizant of the time because we are finished at 1 o'clock, so I want to leave ample time for questions. So I am going to go through this, make a few comments, and then we're going to open this up to questions. Michael laid out a lot for thought. One of the challenges when we have a discussion like this is how do you take incredibly complex, diverse? It's a mile wide and it's a mile deep. And how do we bring it to you so that you are able to internalize this, understand it, and I think most importantly, how does it affect you? What does it mean to you? We're sitting here in Montana. These events are taking place. We've got the map of China up here. And as you can see, this is a vast landmass that as you move, you bring it from China into, of course, Russia, which shares a major border with China, and of course with Ukraine. Now, how do you explain this? How do you get some depth and understanding of the complexity of this issue? And what I came up with is, I'll just move past this map, 21st century risks, which is what we're dealing with right now. And I did not purposely put this up, but I thought about this as number one, but given the situation, nuclear war. And Michael said, I think very accurately, would Russia be the threat that it is without nuclear weapons? And I think the answer is pretty clear. One thing that I found very interesting and both disturbing, prior to the war, the US intelligence services had believed that Russia's military was far more effective, or would be far more effective, better trained, equipment, all the things I would mention, logistics, you name it, go down the list. Whatever was the failure has to be as much of an issue and a concern, which is how did we get it so wrong? How did we miss what was very quickly revealed to be a paper tiger? And I'm not dismissing its capabilities. Russia has a policy in terms of that goes back decades. They pound their adversaries with vast amounts of artillery and heavy equipment. This has been the Russian methodology. It's failed. And right now, as I'm going through this, I want you to think about why is Putin saying the things that he is? Why is he reacting in the way? And I believe it's because you're seeing in real time the defeat and embarrassment of the Russian military and Putin's leadership. So nuclear war, at the top of the list, things that we don't maybe think about, uncontrolled artificial intelligence, issues that will make not only the fighting of wars, but economic competition more intense in the years to come. We are just beginning to understand the applicability and the potential of AI. That story is yet to be told, will unfold, not just in the years, but the decades to come. Fragmented market globalization. We heard in the previous administration certain phrases, and we had distinct situations where we were discussing non-cooperation with global trading partners and bringing this back to the U.S., making the U.S. more competitive, not just from an economic standpoint, but politically as well. Not easy to do. I think this is one of the more misrepresented issues. The world is globalized. The world has been globalized almost since the beginning of time in a much smaller scale, but nevertheless. So to say, we can decouple, I believe is an erroneous and misleading statement, but you hear the rhetoric and getting into your own respective corners when having to deal with these very complex issues is not going to solve the problems. Climate change. Let me tell you a little story that I just uncovered. Russia's ability to fight this war and to be recognized economically as a significant player is based exclusively on its oil and gas and other resources, which includes substantial amounts of fertilizer and industrial equipment. But Russia is not going to be and would not have the effectiveness without its oil and gas. Well, guess what's happening in the eastern part of the country in the subarctic areas, which depend on frozen ground. They're starting to thaw. You're starting to see the effects of climate changes, whatever you wish to call it. Temperatures are warming. You're seeing this permafrost area starting to defrost. Well, guess what's in that permafrost? Pipelines, infrastructure. That infrastructure and those pipelines are going to be adversely affected as this continues. Russia is already acutely aware of this. Now, where did the sanctions come into place? Russia depends heavily on Western technology and equipment to run its oil and gas operations. So you take the combination of sanctions, which are not quite yet to the place and probably never will be, but we're starting to see the effects economically. You talk about equipment that needs and is very sophisticated, and then you add the issue of climate change and the effect on the permafrost. And you're starting to see complications that very few people probably even consider in terms of the probabilities. Green energy revolution, energy challenges. This is massive. Michael, you made comments about Europe. Prior to even this conflict, Europe electric prices were spiking radically. Why did that happen? Well, kind of the irony is the wind didn't blow. They don't get a lot of their electricity from offshore, but they get enough that when the wind was very quiet during the winter prior to this upcoming winter, it affected the amount of electric availability. They had to find other sources. So what did they go back to? Dirty fossil fuels, gas, coal. They shut down their nuclear facilities. We know the reasons behind it, but they did not plan for the contingencies of moving towards a renewable green energy future side by side with the need still for decades to come. You may not want to hear this. I'm telling you, you will be using oil, gas, and coal for decades yet to come in different forms. So the challenge is going to be, how do you integrate that in a manner that does not have what a direct impact on your standard of living? When you can't pay your bills, when the cost of goods and services go up exponentially, which is what's happening right now in Europe, because Russia's ace in the hole is their oil and gas exports to Europe. 40% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia, about 25% in the form of oil. This is a stranglehold that Putin has always believed would be the demise of NATO's cooperation because of the effects and pressure from the governments. You're already seeing industries that are shutting down or cutting back drastically. They're considering some types of you and I not being able to maybe have our lights on for several hours a day, or they're looking at policies of subsidizing their citizens. These all have implications and ramifications. So when we're looking at moving to this green future, we need to have better, more intelligent, thoughtful, and realistic conversations about what it's going to take. I always mention this. How many people want to see mining grow exponentially in the United States as an extractive industry? You'd like to see more mining or less? Maybe I phrased the question wrong. You want to see more? A lot more. Why? All right. What you're saying correctly is the stuff you're mining for. I'll put that a little more succinctly. Rare earth minerals. Right now, China is a major producer of rare earth minerals. So are some countries in Africa. Guess what we have here in the United States, in Alaska, states like California, even in places in the Midwest and on the East Coast. Maine has the potential for the substantial mining of rare earth minerals. Now, we need that if we're going to move to this greener future, don't we? Electric cars generate electricity not from hope and prayers, but from real substances, such as coal, or in the case of solar, but you need batteries. Batteries need rare earth minerals. So do you want to get it out of someplace, maybe in Zaire, where the regulatory environment, the environmental restrictions, child labor laws, for most parts, don't exist? Or do you want to do it in a country that has a legal system and has the type of structure to at least put in place for the protection, as well as the national security issue? I'm sorry I have to get through this a little quick because I really do think we're going to have a lot of questions. Incentivizing innovation. What do I mean by that? Do not put policies in place that are disincentives to innovation. One of the great strengths of the United States and several other countries is its economic innovation and its encouraging and funding of research. If you want to compete in the world with China, which you will be, for decades, if not centuries to come. Your greatest strength is, in my opinion, sitting in this room right now. It's your human capital. It's your students coming up through the educational system. But when they get out, they want to be in a system that incentivizes and rewards the innovation, which lends itself to technological changes, whether it's AI, green energy, battery storage. That's where you gain your advantages. And don't think for a second that China is not attempting to do the same thing. Oops. That didn't work very well. All right, natural disasters. They're here, they're not going away. And if we connect this to some of the issues of climate change, they're expected to get worse, which means what? This is not a surprise, never should be, just as a pandemic should not have been a surprise. Pandemics have been around since the beginning of time, will continue to. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, they're worsening. So what does that mean? Your resiliency, both in terms of your responsibility as citizens, but for the people that represent us, held to task of both capital as well as education. Nothing is more telling than what is happening right now in Pakistan. Who has been following the events that have unfolded in Pakistan? We got one person here. You want to tell everybody what's happening that may not know? Loudly enough so they can hear, please.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reading on mostly the New York Times about it yesterday. They're up to 1,500 people dead. They don't expect the flood waters, which are still 3 to 6 feet high in different regions, to recede for 6 to 12 more months.
Right. Pakistan is going through devastating floods right now. They are not prepared. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the emergency responsiveness. This is devastating to them. These type of events are going to continue, and they typically are going to happen in the most vulnerable countries where the population is also the greatest at risk. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because this all connects to what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and China, relations with the US. This is all interconnected, folks. Don't think of this as separate issues. And that's why I always talk about resiliency, financial crisis. Well, when you're having a financial crisis, you tend to look inward. And what are we all experiencing right now? If you're in the stock market, yeah, not a good time. But more to the point, that affects every one of us in this room, inflation. So when I talk about Europe and its energy crisis, I'm talking about inflation. When I'm talking about what's happening with the Ukraine and Russia, and we're looking at food exports, we're talking about inflation. When China's having a major drought right now, which is causing electric production to decline precipitously, it's affecting both their industry and their population. Now, when you're talking about a food crisis and exports of wheat, you're talking about competition. Now, a country like China with its population is going to be looking for sources of getting wheat to supplement what may be lost from either other sources or its own production. That puts them in competition. Ultimately, as these prices go up, who are the more vulnerable populations? Countries in the Middle East, North Africa, are going to be and are already seeing the net effect of this. Increasing authoritarianism. We've seen this in many different ways, where we're seeing this bifurcation between different types of philosophy as two governments. Do we maintain an open liberal system versus an authoritarian type of system? What are the impacts? What are the messages that are being sent to their people? Something that we cannot overlook, and will continue. Here I go again. All right. What did I do wrong here? All right, let me go through. All right, while we're getting this squared away, what do we have for time, Michael? Because I want to leave enough for conversation here.
We are at quarter up.
Okay, I'll mention two last things. I want you to think about demographics. Russia has a significant problem, and so does China. At opposite ends of the spectrum, you would think, well, one country has 1.3 billion people. Why is that a demographic problem? And then we have Russia, which has a relatively small population. Thank you. Russia's replacement of its death versus birth rates is in decline. That's not good for your economics. It's not good for your military. It's not good for a number of different reasons, which causes problems in terms of decisions you make. Their population, males average age several years ago was living to their late 50s. Now Putin had put policies in place to encourage a birth, higher population increases, alcoholism, depression, huge problems for males in Russia. I know that may sound trite, but it's not. China has 1.3 billion people, but guess what's happening? It's aging. So they've got challenges that are very unique, even with the population. How do you take care of that aging population? Europe is in many cases, no better position. Declining birth rates. Where we're seeing increasing birth rates are typically in regions and countries that are the least prepared. So do not underestimate, and I encourage everybody to learn more about demographic issues and its consequences. Now, I'm just going to close this. In talking about these countries, especially in Asia, some of the greatest growth in terms of economic outcomes will be in what we refer to as the emerging economies. That puts us in direct competition with resources, the need for oil, gas, alternative energy. This is going to be one of the great challenges in the 21st century. How do you meet these needs of these emerging and burgeoning economies? And then for me, the heck with this, I am not doing very well with this today, is water. Water is the 21st century gold. So what I've tried to do is just give you very briefly, I had 20 listed in there, but just give you briefly how interconnected, complex these various issues are. Some of which drives some of the things that we're seeing right now in terms of food scarcity, water, militarization, all the things that I've just mentioned. At the end of the day, we're talking about somebody that said, you are a part of my historic Russian homeland. And he is right now experiencing a fatal flaw, which is lack of information, hubris, and a military that has been grossly overestimated to its effectiveness and efficiency. China is watching all this very closely. The last meeting he had in China just several days ago, I believe it was said to him, we also are not fully or very cautiously watching the outcome of this. China has consequences to backing the regime. And they have, I'm going to say they probably are stepping back a little bit to see what the outcome is going to be. Because what is happening with Russia will have a pronounced effect on China and its own decisions, as well as some of the political implications as well. So time is growing short. Questions, please. And you can direct those towards Michael or myself. In the back. Yeah, just raise our voice just a little bit for the others.
Proxy?
I think I understand your question. I'll be very brief and I'll turn this over to Michael. First of all, there's these kind of crazy rules of the game. We are at war with Ukraine. I mean, we are at war with Russia through our proxy, the Ukraine. But we can't do certain things. As long as we stay within some type of quietly approved, not approved way of conducting how we're supporting Ukraine, it's acceptable, which is bizarre because people are getting killed. Now, I don't believe we can afford not to help Ukraine. I don't believe Europe cannot afford to help Ukraine. Remember one thing about Taiwan. Without Taiwan, everything you do that is what makes your world work would not exist. Why? semiconductors. So they are a vital national interest, not just the United States, but globally as well. Michael.
And I just add to, and not only semiconductors, but if mainland China were also to control Taiwan and control the Straits of Taiwan,
Oh, yeah.
that is about half of the world's GDP that goes through there, and that would be a significant strategic gain for the Chinese and loss for the United States. So that's something else to consider. There are things, even though these things seem remote, as Bob said, they have ramifications at home. They have ramifications for energy, for food, for inflation, actually. I mean, one of the things that kept inflation down for so many years is that stuff was made cheaply in China.
Yeah. And that's why we passed the National Semiconductor Act. We recognize the strategic issues and interests. So we want to encourage that fabrication and the companies that are involved in those industries. Okay, I'm cognizant of time, so Michael, you can make some comments.
So go ahead. You were.
First of all, what does Russia have to offer many of these countries? You have to ask that question first. Is it resources? Is it capital for trade purposes? Russia is not exactly in demand for their products and services other than oil and gas and military equipment. So you have to be very strategic when you're looking and talking about what African countries, what region. China has been in Africa, the continent, for a number of years, acquiring and making deals which have been problematic for them. And I don't want to go into too much depth about that, but you've got to be very careful with what you see and what the actual outcomes are. Are they positive? Are they accretive? Are they something that is building long-term relations? China's had a lot of blowback in some of the countries in Africa because of their behavior and methodology of doing business.
We're going to talk about energy and our reliance on oil and gas. Why is nuclear seen primarily in the West as a dead letter?
Perception, fear. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island.
Chernobyl is the big one.
Yeah.
3 Mile Island too in the United States.
Yeah.
And we haven't done anything in the way of nuclear since. France gets about 70% of its
Right.
electricity from nuclear, which is why its policy has diverged somewhat from Germany's, because Germany has closed so much of their nuclear capability and has the rest on schedule to be closed. And that means that Germany is that much more dependent on, ironically, on fossil fuels. Because, and nuclear obviously is clean. On the other hand, there's a real problem there. If anything goes wrong, it's really bad. I mean, it's as bad as a blowout in an oil rig offshore is, and it's catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's minuscule compared to what can happen, like at Chernobyl. On the other hand, 3 Mile Island was 50 years ago. Has anybody been to the museum at 3 Mile Island? Because it's worth going to. You don't come out glowing, it's okay. But nobody died. And what is most interesting about that, look at the technology. They're dials, they're levers. There's no digital stuff. This was the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
The technology that we're talking about today is enormously different from what was available at 3 Mile Island in the 1970s. And that is enormously different from Chernobyl, which was primitive for its day in the 1980s.
I will say this, and this is my opinion. Look and listen to what are thoughts and views of those who you may not agree with. Because it's more telling when you see things start to change. Why? When leading environmentalists are coming out today and saying we need to use more nuclear energy if we're going to bridge this gap between fossil fuels and what they hope to be the renewable future. It's very telling when they are making comments that several years ago you never heard. I believe that if you take any time, the industry, to Michael's point, has changed radically. Smaller, more different types of facilities, higher degrees of safety are absolutely critical if we're going to make progress And especially when I mention about emerging economies, if they do not have uninterrupted sources of energy, they can never get the infrastructure and the standard of living which is necessary to bring their people to a place. By necessity.
China, Taiwan is a question of China. China is a problem, and by which we can figure out that we can. It's a multipolar world, and what has happened 90% of the war, there was motivated to fracture the relationship between the West and the West. It has not been done, and contrary to there were a lot of promises, not written, not on video, between Chancellor Kohl, Baker, remember Baker working for Bush, and Yeltsin at the time, Gorbachev first, and Yeltsin that NATO will push east.
Mm-hmm.
Putin was not on the stage yet, he wasn't the fact. So the US and Europe have, as you said, there was strong spying practices, right? And they had lost the usual sharp forward again. And with the consequence now with face, that there's a responsibility. Remember when the Chicago boys went to Moscow and had collapsed the economy, which never happened in China, which kept by the Canada. So it's a multiple, and the US, they are the axis of the world.
So Michelle, we didn't forget to mention this. We were just waiting for you to bring it up. And thank you very much for the comments, because this is part of what I was trying to convey here. These are the issues: civic engagement, citizen responsibility. All of this is interconnected. We can't survive and move forward without the type of engagement that reflects the kind of multipolar world that we exist in.
I think there's also a point related to what Michelle was talking about,
Yeah.
which is that China has spent a lot of time studying what happened in the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
and they do not want that to happen to them. And as Michelle pointed out, what you have evolving there is less a communist economy than it is state capitalism, or closer to fascism, as has been indicated. But there's one thing I want to add to the discussion about renewables, because we tend to be very narrow when we talk about it. So we talk about wind and solar, and those are renewables, and those are things that should go into the equation without doubt. But you can't rely on something that won't provide what you need it to provide, and which you don't have the technology yet, and we don't know which way technology will go. And I want to leave with this thought about, what do you do about evolving technology? If you remember, we outlawed incandescent bulbs before we had an adequate replacement for them. We had those dopey little swirly CFLs that came on after 5 minutes. If it was in a hallway, you'd already fallen down and killed yourself before they ever came on. And they were much more expensive than the incandescents that they replaced. And you're asking working class Americans to pay a lot more money for these, but they'll save money in the long run. Well, not exactly, because if you turn on an incandescent, a CFL, and an incandescent, the CFL will last longer. But if you turn them on and off, which is kind of the way we use light bulbs, the CFLs last less long. So they were more expensive, they lasted less long, provided inadequate and light and not safe light in some cases. We were saved by the LEDs that came along and replaced them. People did not see that. The future was fluorescent, but it wasn't. So often technology takes a turn that we never see coming.
That's right.
And replaces it. And so while there's hope for solar and wind, and there's hope for nuclear too, and there needs to be a place for all of this in the period, my guess, and it's no more than that, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an expert, I don't even play one on television, but there is, it may well be that some other source of technology is the answer to our energy problem that we don't see coming or that we don't understand yet. Somebody in somebody's basement somewhere is working on it.
Has to be scalable, and it has to fit within your economic foundation so that it is affordable, regardless of the type of energy sources. And it is complicated, and it will be a battle. And by doing and having these conversations, we hope to provide insights and education. We have time maybe for two more questions, and we'll wrap it up. I would humbly disagree that we are trying to do something which is costing you money, which is raising interest rates. The Fed is raising rates as we speak, probably another 75 basis points. Now, it may not matter if you own a home or don't have debt or pay or have credit cards, but that's few and far between in terms of probably people in this room. You have some type of debt instrument. You are going to continue to pay more. The objective is interest rates rise enough, it slows the economy. It's a weird juxtaposition. It's like I got to kill the patient to get him healthy. It's got to be somebody's filter from a politician, right?
But it is also, it is a consequence of decisions made by our leaders.
Exactly. Yeah.
These things don't just happen. Policies have consequences.
Right.
This is something people in Washington often forget. And I'd take a little exception to what Bob said about some people not being affected. If you rent, you're affected by increase.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was just talking about debt instruments like on your credit card, but no, everybody living in this room is paying extraordinary amounts of money just to live on the rent side.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we have a time issue here. Thank you so all very much, Michael. Thank you very much for your comments and your insights. So thank you for coming, folks.